Hello, my name is Aidan Rupert, alongside me, Rob Murray, and welcome to episode 15 of the WCHC Sports Podcast, where we discuss the latest news and updates from across the sports world. Whether it's Holy Cross Athletics, Boston Celtics Center Taco Fall, or anything in between, WCHC Sports 88.1 FM has got you covered. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube page and give us a follow on Instagram while you're at it at WCHC_sports. So Rob, you and I today, we are going to do another sort of special episode, if you can even call it that. At this point, we're basically just putting out whatever comes to mind. But seeing as it is Thanksgiving, and happy Thanksgiving to all of our listeners, we are sort of going to touch upon the theme of gratitude. And Rob, you and I put together some short lists of the top 5 things we are grateful for in sports. These aren't necessarily in any particular order. And obviously, Rob and I are huge sports junkies. There's just so much to list. But here are just some of the top things that come to mind in talking about sports and all they mean to us. And Rob, I sort of, just before we get things started, want to get your thought process on this. What are some of the thoughts that really went into putting this list together for you?
Yeah, it was when you gave me this idea, or you posed it to me earlier today. I loved it, but I didn't realize how difficult it would be to just condense everything I'm thankful for in the world of sports down to 5 things. And obviously, that list can go on and on. But I really had to think long and hard about some of the memorable games, players, events that really stood out to me as my 20 years as a sports fan. And I'm really glad we're getting to do this because I'm looking at your list. We see some differences, but we also see some similarities. And I'm sure many of our listeners are going to feel the same way when they hear some of the things we're thankful for. So it was a very difficult selection process, but at the end of the day, that's part of the fun. That's part of the debate. And I'm excited to see what we have in store here today.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm totally with you on that. I think some of these, for both of us, maybe sort of instantaneously came to mind. But then there are some other things that really, it takes that season of gratitude to really have the wherewithal to sort of stand back and think about, okay, well, this is pretty cool. We're really lucky that we have this as sports fans. And that's sort of what we're trying to do with this podcast. Just get our listeners thinking about, sports, and especially the absence of sports for so many months of 2020. It was rough on all of us. So now that we have all of our leagues rolling, at least to some extent, without further ado, here is our top 5 countdown for things we are most grateful for in sports. So I will get us started. Just imagine you're in a time machine real quick. Flip the clock back to April 13th of 2016. And that was the day of Kobe Bryant's farewell game, as at 37 years old, the late, great Kobe Bryant put up 60 points in a 101-96 victory over Gordon Hayward and the Utah Jazz back in 2016, who had actually entered play against the Lakers that night, seeking out the 8th and final playoff seed out west. And Kobe and his Lakers, but especially Kobe, seemed to have other plans, as Bryant put up 60 points on 22 of 50 shooting. Not efficient by any stretch, but not so inefficient either. And it was Bryant's first 50-point game since 2009 and the 6th 60-point game of his career. And it could not have come on a better night, Rob. I remember watching this one. It was a late game, probably a 10:30 start. I remember I did have school the next day, but, Snoop Dogg was in the house. We had celebrities, not just in the front row, but in the second row, the third row. Everybody was packing Staples Center, wanting to see Kobe. And just an interesting note or two on this game, there was so much buzz and even nervous energy, if you can even say Kobe ever got nervous, surrounding this game, that Kobe actually missed his first 5 field goal attempts in the first quarter. Not a lot of people recall that, but I remember watching it and I was just groaning. I was like, Kobe cannot go out like this. And later we found out Kobe would not go out like that. But those first 5 shots, they were sort of just heaves. One of them was an air ball, but he more than made up for it later on. Lakers were down 10 points. I mentioned they won by 5. They were down 10 points with just 2.5 minutes left. And Kobe Bryant did what he did best, or what he always did best. And that was he scored 13 straight points to put the Lakers ahead. And I'll say one last thing about this, just as a sort of ironic twist on what was an all-time performance for the Black Mamba. His very last NBA play, Rob, ironically was an assist. It was an assist to a streaking Jordan Clarkson who put in a layup as time expired. And for Kobe, a player that embraced Mamba mentality as a means of shooting the ball nearly every trip down throughout most of his NBA career, a little bit ironic to see that last one be a dime to his teammate. But yeah, this game, it meant so much to me to watch. Quite honestly, I've cried a few times watching basketball games. I cried as a 11 or 12-year-old when LeBron took out the Celtics in 2012. Those were tears of rage. Probably shed a tear or two when Boston's Big Three was done, when I realized that Pierce and Garnett were not coming back to the Celtics. But then there was this game in 2016, and there was just something about it. The stage being set up so perfectly for Kobe Bryant's farewell game and the Mamba delivering. So that is number one on my list of just sports moments that I am and was grateful for.
Yeah, in a farewell game like that, for a legend like Kobe Bryant is just so rare in sports. As much as we'd love to see it for every great player we come across, it just doesn't happen. You have Michael Jordan, who kind of went out quietly. Peyton Manning went out with the Super Bowl, but he was carried in that game by his defense. I think he only threw for 140 yards. Larry Bird had injuries hobble him throughout the end of his career. Magic Johnson went out a little unceremoniously with his diagnosis of AIDS. So, it's extremely difficult to be playing at such a high level for such a long time and to have such a memorable performance like Kobe did. And to be honest, when he first had it, Aiden, I was a little skeptical about everyone giving him so much credit because you look at that 22 for 50 shooting, and it certainly does raise some eyebrows, don't get me wrong. But as time has gone on and I've learned who Kobe was as a player and more so a competitor, it makes all the sense in the world that he had a 660-point game of his career that night. Like you said, his first 50-point game in nearly 7 years. And of course, getting an assist on his final play as a member of the Los Angeles Lakers. It was one of those moments that even casual NBA fans will never forget. And before I move on to my first thing I'm grateful for, remember, Aiden, that night was legendary for the National Basketball Association on its own, but there was another game being played at the same time. It was the Golden State Warriors against, I think, the Memphis Grizzlies. And the Warriors, of course, were in the middle of their historic 73-9 season. They needed a win in their final game to beat the 95-96 Bulls all-time record of 72 wins in a season, and they did that. So, a legend like Kobe Bryant going out with 60 in his final game of the Warriors, making history and cementing themselves as perhaps the greatest team of all time, certainly the best regular season of all time. That day will go down in not only basketball, but sports history.
True. Kobe stole the headlines for sure. Sorry to the Golden State Warriors.
Of course, he did it in the only way he knew how. But that leads me to my number one thing I'm thankful for on my list. It's the Chicago Cubs winning the 2016 World Series. I'm sure you're as surprised as anyone, Aiden. But, an 8-7 win in a 10-inning Game 7. I speak obviously from a bit of a biased perspective, but I think a lot of baseball fans would agree with me in saying that was one of the greatest games in MLB history, given the consequences. On one hand, you had the Cubs, who broke a 108-year-long championship drought, the longest in North American sports history, and their opponent, the Cleveland Indians, who had their own 68-year championship drought. So the stakes were perhaps as high as any championship series in American sports. Unfortunately for the Indians, they lost that series in 7 games. and now hold the record of longest drought with 72 years, as they fell short yet again in 2020. And Aidan, I'd seen some poor Cubs teams in my lifetime. I'd gone through my fair share of disappointment with the Cubs. 2007 and 2008, they were first in their division and got swept out of the playoffs in the first round each time. In 2015, they got all the way to the National League Championship Series just to get swept by the New York Mets, who certainly aren't one of my favorite teams. But I certainly didn't suffer the lifelong trauma that a lot of Cubs fans did, including my dad, who saw the Cubs fall short when they had some great teams in 1969, 1984, 89, 2003 with the infamous Steve Bartman catch. So seeing him not only enjoy that Cubs win, but really get emotional that night at 3:00 in the morning on November 4th, 2016, was really a special moment for me, and one that I certainly won't forget as a sports fan and a son. So, it leaves me speechless sometimes just going back and watching the highlights of that final play to clinch the World Series. It was the fourth title as a Chicago fan that I've witnessed. The Blackhawks have won 3 championships, and I've been lucky enough to see them. But the Cubs winning in 2016 was easily the best. The city of Chicago, you could feel almost let out a giant sigh of relief as just years and years of grief and heartbreak seemed to fade away on that night in Cleveland. And it certainly curbs my championship hunger for at least another decade or so, because I know I'll never see anything like that again, even if the Cubs win again, which hopefully it won't take another 108 years, but we'll see.
Rob, that's a really good one to point out. 2016 was one heck of a year in sports. Obviously, we mentioned Kobe and the Cubs, but you talking about Chicago, it made me think of a commercial that I saw right about that time, or more likely a year or two prior to 2016. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with the ad. And quite honestly, I could be mistaken a couple of the details, but I think it was from MLB The Show or whoever the preeminent.
I know where this is going.
That commercial? Yeah, it's
Yep.
essentially they were sort of showcasing their franchise mode or their fantasy mode, where you can take up control over a franchise and lead them to the promised land of a World Series victory. And it was a pretty comedic ad. It had basically a Chicago resident leading the Cubs to a World Series win and crying tears of joy as a result. So I'm pretty sure that ad must have aired prior to that 2016 World Series win. Otherwise, it would have lost nearly all of its comedic value. But, that's sort of what we ended up witnessing the way you're describing it to me. It was such a long drought. And as you mentioned, Cleveland now holds that drought. And the Cubs weren't going to let the Cleveland sports world get 2 in 1 year, seeing as LeBron usurped the 73-9 Warriors after coming back from a 3-1 deficit. But yeah, it's sort of just a funny note. I'm pretty sure that was the ad that aired around 2014, 2015.
Yeah, and a lot of jokes came at my expense among my friends after the airing of that ad. I heard a ton of, that's the only time you'll see the Cubs win the World Series in a video game. But yeah, you're right. 2016 was, if you think about it, just an incredible year of sports. You had the Cubs winning, you had Kobe in his final game, you had LeBron and the Cavs making one of the most improbable comebacks in postseason history. And you had just a few months after 2016, the New England Patriots coming back from a 28-3 deficit against the Atlanta Falcons. So if you talk about some of the greatest years for sports in the last 50 years, 2016 has got to be at the top of that list.
I think we could do a whole show on 2016, not to mention this guy right behind me there, the big ticket Kevin Garnett. 2015 to 2016 was his last year in the NBA, as was Tim Duncan, I believe, seeing as they entered the Hall of Fame the same year as first ballot Hall of Famers. So yeah, 2016, definitely a year to remember. But moving on to number 2 on my list. This one's a little bit more abstract, but I am very grateful for some of the parity that we see in today's sports leagues. As you know, Rob, I am a diehard NBA fan, and what a lot of people have been saying about the NBA for years now is it's just too predictable. Obviously, there are thrilling highlights, thrilling games, thrilling superstars, but at the end of the day, we were seeing the Cavaliers versus the Golden State Warriors in 4 straight NBA finals. And what's more, we were seeing between the Miami Heat and Cleveland Cavaliers, we were seeing LeBron James rule the East for 8 straight years. And, you know, it's something that people took offense to or people didn't necessarily enjoy. I think on the flip side of that, sports dynasties are so fun to watch. They're so fun to root for. And frankly, they're actually kind of fun to root against in some cases. I know a whole lot of people like, putting the Patriots on full blast whenever they're given the opportunity. But yeah, I'm looking at the Patriots, I'm looking at the Golden State Warriors, and those are really two franchises that dominated their respective sports for an extended stretch. I know it wasn't necessarily every year for the Patriots. They were sort of more along the lines of, say, a San Antonio Spurs, who they were there, then maybe they took a year off, but then they were right back in the mix. But yeah, we've really started to see some competitive balance return to some of our leagues. And a lot of people feel that that's just a more riveting experience to have no idea what team you're going to see in any sports finals. I know just a year ago we were talking about, Rob, this is finally it for the NBA. The Raptors were just coming off of their first NBA championship, and the consensus surrounding the league was that this is the most open the NBA has been in years and years. LeBron, and we'll talk about LeBron in a little bit. LeBron was coming off a 1 year playoff sabbatical, if you will, in part due to his injury. And so you look at a lot of those teams and you figure, I don't know who's going to the finals. This should be fun to buckle up and watch. And in the end, the season took just about a year to complete. I wouldn't say it was the most surprising outcome in that the Lakers ultimately were crowned champions in 2020. But look at their finals opponent, for instance. Nobody saw the Miami Heat getting there. They weren't even a playoff team the year before. So, long story short, I'm really thankful just today, this day and age, the parity that we have in many of our sports leagues.
I am too, but I also like the point you made about dynasties. And I'd like to go through my relationship with how I viewed dynasties the past few years, because I think it's kind of unique, and I don't know if I could relate to too many sports fans out there. Let me know what you think. But you look at teams like you mentioned, the Golden State Warriors, the New England Patriots, and they're so easy to hate and root against, which I did my fair share of. Believe me, having a brother in the same house who's a Patriots fan while I'm a Bears fan, and having to see his team in the Super Bowl every other year, and my Bears at the bottom of the NFC most times was very frustrating, and a lot of animosity grew between us because of that. But at the same time, when you saw how dominant teams like the Pats and the Warriors were during those times, it makes you appreciate kind of excellence in their respective sports, how easy they made things look, how dominant they were against even the league's best teams. Tom Brady and the Patriots every single year just picking apart opposing defenses, like it was nothing, just methodical drives down the field, getting the defense tired, capitalizing in the end zone. It was almost a masterpiece to the passionate sports fan. And in basketball, you had the Golden State Warriors when they added Kevin Durant. The rich got richer, and the product on the courts was somehow elevated. You had three of some of the best shooters we've ever seen in the league, in Clay, Steph, and Durant. They were bombing threes all over the place. They were cutting to the basket. They were dunking. They were pulling out flashy assists and beating teams by 30, it seemed, every night. But they looked damn good doing it. And they made quick work of LeBron James as well, which only a few teams can say they ever did. So I hear you. Parity, I think, is a great thing for sports year in and year out. But when a dynasty like the Patriots or the Warriors comes along, I would recommend maybe just sitting back and enjoying the excellence unfold, because it can really be a beautiful thing to see some of these teams in action.
That's a good point, Rob. I think For starters, I like how you mentioned with the Warriors, the rich got richer. They were the 73-9 Golden State Warriors, the best record in NBA history. And I think that's maybe what people took so much offense to, as opposed to, and I'm not disagreeing with you. I think certainly it's so very much worth being just in the present when it comes to these teams, appreciating them as witnessing history. I think that people maybe frown upon the Golden State Warriors because of Kevin Durant and maybe, supporters of a dynasty like the New England Patriots. In large part, it was a lot of homegrown talent for that team. Nobody sort of exhibited that more than Tom Brady, of course. So I think there is a distinction to be made. I'm all for, like you said, supporting these dynasties, not necessarily supporting, but respecting and appreciating these dynasties as they reign their respective leagues. But you're right. I think that someday we end up seeing a sort of last dance type documentary about Steph Curry and the Golden State Warriors and all that went into that team, and eventually its demise, if you can call it that.
That's right, and I'll certainly be one of the first ones to watch that. It was a very interesting time in the NBA's history. But while we're on the topic of parity, I'd like to bring up my number two thing that I'm thankful for, and that's the NCAA March Madness tournament, with which I think perhaps exhibits the idea of parity within sports the best. I think in no other amateur or professional sport can you see any given team beat, a favorite in a given day. All it takes is one loss to be bounced out of this tournament, and we've seen upsets upon upsets across the years of, for example, number 16 UMBC beating Virginia in 2018, something nobody thought was possible, and then Virginia winning it all the next year in 2019, getting redemption. You don't see storylines like that. You don't see upsets like that anywhere else. And of course, on a lighter note, no other sport gives you an excuse to sit on the couch all day for 4 days in a row. As you can watch the Thursday through Sunday slate of games for the first and second round, and then come back next week and do it all again with the Sweet 16 and the Elite Eight. And to add on, I would argue making bracket after bracket with your friends is even more enjoyable than fantasy sports. And I'm a huge lover of fantasy football in particular. But when you get hot during that first weekend and nail all of your picks in your bracket, there's no better feeling until it inevitably collapses in the next round when a 14 seed gets to the later stages. But like I was saying before, you see some improbable Cinderella stories. Some that come to mind are number 11 VCU getting to the Final Four back in 2011. Some schools you just never heard of that get their moment in the national spotlight, and those teams are remembered forever in history. UConn's magical runs with Kemba Walker in 2011 and Shabazz Napier in 2014 are some others. As a Connecticut native, I can tell you how much I enjoyed watching those underdog teams really just get so hot and dismantle great basketball teams across the country in the months of March and April. And lastly, Kentucky, another team that was really good coming into the NCAA tournament. Their season coming to a shocking end in 2014 at the hands of Wisconsin in the national semifinal when they had 9 players who went to the NBA. So you really don't know what you're going to get with March Madness, but I think that's the whole fun of it, is just going into a tournament and seeing all teams from all across the country play each other and really not understanding at all what's going to transpire on the floor because they just haven't seen each other all season.
Yeah, I think you nailed it, Rob. The one team I will add on to some of those underdog Cinderella stories would have to be the Loyola Chicago Ramblers, right? I think.
It is the Ramblers, yeah.
Yeah, no, we saw them just a few years back make that Final Four, and it was just one of those runs that, for me, I don't know about you, but just as a college student, it makes me think, you know what? If they can do it, maybe someday Holy Cross ends up in their position. Maybe not a Final Four, but how about a 16 seed beating a 1 seed at the very least? last time we saw Holy Cross in the NCAA tournament, of course, was 2016, when obviously before our time at Holy Cross. But, the promised land, it's there. Adding on to March Madness, college basketball has a really unique system in that basically anyone can make the big dance in theory. All you have to do is win your conference tournament. And that's obviously no small feat itself. But, Holy Cross, when they made that 2016 NCAA tournament, they were far from favored from winning the Patriot League. They went on a spectacular, dare I say, miraculous run to even get their feet in the door in the NCAAs. So, yeah, it's interesting to watch. Like you said, 4 straight days on the couch. Although I will say some of my fondest high school memories have to do with some of my friends just getting in trouble for trying to watch the games in class on their phones. They start crying about their brackets and how they need to see how they're doing. Because you're right, you do get attached to your bracket, but absolutely, March Madness is something that cannot be replaced. And we really want that back in 2021, hopefully. Whether it becomes May Madness, as Coach Rick Pitino has recently suggested or urged for, that remains to be seen. But it was certainly, a sore spot of 2020 in that we never got to experience that. So I'm definitely with you on that.
Yeah, that's the beauty of the whole tournament. Is you mentioned Holy Cross and how they just went on sort of an improbable run in the Patriot League tournament and found their way into the big dance. Once you get there and find yourself on a little bit of a hot streak, anything goes. Anything can happen on any given day. And I think no playoff format in all of American sports exemplifies that better than March Madness. And let's move on to your number 3 thankful element of the sports world, and that's LeBron James's longevity. Tell me about it.
Yeah, sort of just to flip the idea of parody and the underdog story on its head a little bit. LeBron James, let's be real, he's been doing this longer than nearly anyone else in the league right now, and he's been doing it better than just about anyone in the league right now. The longest absence, speaking of LeBron James's longevity, the longest absence of his career is a mere 17 consecutive games, and that was, as mentioned, just a year ago with the Los Angeles Lakers during the 2018-2019 NBA season. It was due to a groin injury, but it's unreal. And I know there are some wonderful journalistic pieces out there on LeBron James allegedly spending $1 million a year, basically on preserving his body. There are these wild pictures. He basically, Rob, if you didn't know, he very often after games or after practices, he sleeps or he takes his naps in essentially a chamber. I like to call it the Chamber of Secrets, but basically it just, I don't know what it does. I have to do some further reading on this myself, but it like somehow cools his body or just regulates his bodily functions. I'm not quite sure, but point is a lot goes into LeBron James. And as a result, we're talking about the third all-time leading scorer at 34,241 career points, second only to, or third behind Kareem Abdul-Jabbar and Karl Malone, the mailman. And he's also number 8 all-time in minutes played, a rank that's certain to only move forward as LeBron James seems to have somehow a lot of gas left in the tank. And just a couple months ago, or a month or two ago, he became the all-time leader in playoff games played, surpassing Derek Fisher. And a lot of people with LeBron, Rob, you and I have talked about this on recent podcasts. Some people say, okay, well, he's 3-6 or now 4-6 in the finals, and they really hold that against him. But if you talk about the 8-year dominance of not only making the playoffs in the Eastern Conference every year, arguably maybe the weaker conference most years, but making the finals every single year from 2011 to 2018, sort of taking a 1-year vacation to heal up, and then right back in the mix and capturing that 4th title in 2020. It's ridiculous. I mean, he has run into so many Hall of Famers throughout his playoff runs that the 4-6 to me doesn't say this is a player that can't come through in the clutch. As obviously we've seen LeBron James can come through in the clutch. For me, it just says sustained greatness. And I'm not sure. Jordan 6-0, obviously it's a number a lot of people subscribe to. I think there's something magical about that number. But at the same time, 4-6 isn't so shabby either. And LeBron James, really the only question mark that remains for him. I think another title certainly helps his legacy, but it will not define it. I think what will be most interesting is if we end up seeing LeBron James and LeBron James Jr. perhaps share an NBA court. LeBron has been outspoken in saying that that would be, in fact, the greatest accomplishment of his career. Personally, I don't see it happening. Bronny James, LeBron James Jr., he still has a few years of high school left to go, and we'll see what sort of the prep to pro guidelines are looking like for the NBA draft a few years from now, or if, Bronny's even a player that is able to be a one and done. He's ranked in his class, but he's not the top guard by any means, but it'll be interesting to see. I never want to bet against LeBron James, quite frankly. Once again, he's just been doing this for so long. But yeah, in a nutshell, that is LeBron James' sustained greatness and his longevity.
Yeah, you said it best. I mean, it's remarkable how he's been able to sustain his level of play for what now, 18 years? He's going to be going into year 18 next season with the Lakers. So, I'll say it time and time again, Jordan's my guy, but it's getting harder and harder to argue against LeBron James and how he's had such, I guess the right word is a stranglehold on the NBA and the Eastern Conference in particular for the last decade. I know a lot of people point to those 6 finals losses and that rubs them the wrong way. And while, I think there's a case to be made for 6-0 and being perfect in the finals, getting to 10 finals is better than getting to 6. So obviously it matters what you end up doing with those in the first place, but it's really hard to knock LeBron James. And all he's done is he continues to climb up the leaderboard in nearly every statistical category, and certainly the legacy list of the National Basketball Association. And before I move on to my number 3 pick, I'd like to revisit, I guess what it's called, whole body cryotherapy. You mentioned how LeBron spends nearly $1 million a year on recovery, and I'm certainly not surprised the way he's aged on the basketball floor. He seems like he's only getting better and better as time goes on, and he certainly hasn't lost much of his explosiveness on both ends of the floor. So I'm reading through here what cryotherapy is. I mean, I think cryotherapy at the base level is just treating an injury with, a cold temperature. So, you can think of ice packs or a cold like ice bath after a game. But these new methods of cryotherapy that teams are increasingly using, you see people like Zion Williamson using them, Russell Wilson, another athlete who spends over $1 million on his health every year. He uses it. So I'm reading through here. Some of the benefits of cryotherapy include reducing migraine symptoms, numbing nerve irritation, helping treat mood disorders, reducing arthritic pain, treating low-risk tumors, preventing dementia and Alzheimer's, and treating atopic dermatitis and other skin conditions. So I guess the subject is exposed to temperatures of between -200 and -300 degrees Fahrenheit, and they'll stay in there for around 2 to 4 minutes. And apparently it works wonders, as we've seen with LeBron James. So there's a bit of a science lesson for you, Aidan, on our sports podcast.
Great work, Rob. I will say the one side effect of this form of treatment appears to be the hairline. It's something. It's the one thing that has not really been sustainable for LeBron James throughout his career. If I'm LeBron, I'm embracing the bald. We saw MJ do it. We saw Kobe do it. And if I'm Zion Williamson, also treating my body the same way, I'm closely monitoring the situation of the hairline up there just to, he's 20 years old. He's got some time, I would hope, but definitely something to keep an eye on.
That's right. If Father Time has one thing on any of these greats, it's certainly their hairlines, because those are not pretty sights. Kevin Durant is another one we got to see this offseason, certainly looking a little worse for wear. Let's move on. My number 3 thing that I'm thankful for in the sports world is NFL Championship Sunday, not to be confused with Super Bowl Sunday. As much as I love that day, I like NFL Championship Sunday a little more just because you get 2 great consequential games back to back on a Sunday afternoon, determining who goes to the Super Bowl. And this day is a little more special for me because usually the way the Holy Cross calendar works is it falls the day before we have to go back for the spring semester. And obviously that's a time of great excitement. You get to come back, see your friends, start your new classes, and really get back into the swing of things as a student at Holy Cross. So seeing 2 great NFL games and seeing what teams are going to be in the Super Bowl is kind of a nice send off from home as you get ready to go back to the hill. And the only downside I'd say from this day is we have to wait 2 weeks for the Super Bowl instead of 1, because let's be honest, Aidan, nobody likes the Pro Bowl, and it's probably the biggest waste of time in professional sports, along with a lot of other all-star games we see here and there. But before I let you move on with your number 4 pick, 2018 Championship Sunday stands out to me as I'm sure it does to a lot of other football fans. You had 2 very controversial games in terms of officiating. You had the Saints and the Rams in the early window with that infamous no call pass interference on the Rams that ultimately led to them advancing to the Super Bowl. And you had the Chiefs and the Patriots play in what was arguably one of the best games of the year. Tom Brady and Patrick Mahomes going at it, and the Chiefs potentially having the chance to dethrone the kings of the league and the Patriots had it not been for an offside call against D Ford when the Chiefs ended up picking off the subsequent Tom Brady pass. But of course, it was called back as Ford was offside. So that was certainly a memorable day for me, and certainly a memorable day for fans around the league. So NFL Championship Sunday, a blend of, a good volume of games and a blend of a good importance of games as you get to see two awesome contests with some of the best teams in the NFL vying to go to the Super Bowl.
Yeah, I think that's a really valuable insight, Rob. Obviously, NFL Championship Sunday, as you mentioned, it doesn't quite have the cultural draw maybe as the
It's not a national event like the Super Bowl is, but I think it appeals a little more to like the more hardcore fan, I guess.
Which is a great thing, and it just got me thinking. You're right; it's 2 games on the same day. I've been watching, for instance, the NBA conference finals for years now, but how the NBA does is they stagger it. So you'll have obviously, say, even if they're both game 7s, you'll have one on a Monday night, the next on a Tuesday night. You're not going to see both the same night, and I think that's really cool. It sets these teams in the NFL on Championship Sunday. It sets them on the trajectory from 2 weeks out when they play in the Super Bowl. And I will also say, as much as I love a game 7 or a Super Bowl or the March Madness Final Four championship game, it's a little bit deflating because you watch the game, hopefully it's a good game, but then it's over. You have maybe an off season to look forward to, depending on whether your team won or not, but it's over. I think that NFL Championship Sunday is the perfect balance of, AFC, NFC culminating in eventually crowning a champion, but also having sort of a sequel or epilogue to look forward to 2 weeks out, that being the Super Bowl. So I definitely appreciate your insight on that. And I'll definitely also look to check out those games this year more so than in years past.
I'm glad to hear it.
So moving on to number 4 for me, I'll keep this one relatively brief, but just on a personal note, I'm very grateful to be attending Holy Cross, a school that has so much athletic history, most notably perhaps in basketball. Although I was actually reading a bit of a really cool article. It's from 2012, so maybe a little bit dated, but it's from the Holy Cross magazine. It's essentially a countdown of the top 25 sports moments in the college's history. And there are some really, really cool moments on there that I was just perusing. But yeah, I mean, it's not something that I take for granted. I won't say that I was necessarily, when I was a senior in high school, I wasn't seeking out a college based solely off of its athletic prominence or its ties to sports history, but it's a nice silver lining to say the least. And Holy Cross, it's a Patriot League school. The Patriot League it's not the Big Ten. It's not any of those power conferences, but it's really unique in its own regard. And from a personal perspective, it presents like really polished basketball. For instance, you don't have the star player draw again of those major conferences, but it's a pleasure to watch. And once again, just going back to the history of the sports at Holy Cross, you look up in the rafters and you see a Bob Cousy's jersey, you see a Tom Heinsohn or a Togo Palazzi, whatever the case may be. It's just very interesting knowing that you are, in many cases, walking some of the same halls as some of the greats ever to come through. And once again, I sort of put out a plug for it on last podcast, but there's a great documentary out there called College Basketball's Purple Rain. I'm not quite sure. It's not on DVD yet, which is the one thing that's frustrating me. It's not on DVD or on any online streaming platforms. I know it aired regionally in Massachusetts, maybe some other places as well, but it details Holy Cross and their dominance of the 1950s in college basketball, including their NIT championship. So I don't know about you, Rob, but sometimes I know it's a new gym. It's not the one that we saw Heinsohn getting buckets on. But every time I'm up there shooting at Holy Cross at the Hart Center, there's just something really nice about it, just knowing what was going on decades prior.
Yeah, I agree. It does make you feel special in a way. I think the draw you get at Holy Cross is very similar to the ones you get at smaller schools across the country that you wouldn't perhaps experience at some of these big schools like Ohio State or Florida or Texas. And I think we talk about the NCAA tournament. A lot of these smaller teams who are oftentimes at a lack of star power end up being really good fundamentally. And it's nice for a change to just get to see some great team basketball and see a group of guys who I'm sure are very close work together in almost perfect unison. And like you said before, the small campus environment, getting to walk those same hallways as some of the great players at our school makes it all the more special and gives you a much, much deeper connection to your campus and to your school and to your school's pride than perhaps you would at some of these larger institutions. So I think that was a great point you made. I think what you just laid out was probably one of the major appeals for a lot of students to come to Holy Cross, get a really close, tight-knit environment that not only made you feel like you were making the right choice as a student, but as a person too, and getting to experience a really unique campus perspective, one that's certainly tied to its tradition and history that the alumni pride over so much.
Go Cross, go!
That's right. I'll move on to my number 4 selection, staying within the world of basketball, and that's Derrick Rose's prime. I was so thankful for that time period back when I was 10 years old, getting to see him play as a young Chicago Bulls fan. He was the youngest player ever, I believe, to win the MVP award at just 22. He came out of Memphis only 2 years prior. And to be honest, Aidan, he lit the league on fire that year. He had 25 points per game, which for today's standards might seem a little low, but I'm going off anecdotal evidence, obviously, but he made it just look so easy every night, bobbing and weaving through sometimes zone defenders, which made it all the more harder for him to score and pull off some of these incredibly athletic, creative, unique layups that you really didn't see from a whole lot of players in that time period and in time periods before. He also had 7.7 assists per game, shot 33% from three, and led the Bulls to a 62-20 record, which ended up being their best season since the 97-98 Chicago Bulls, who, as you know, was the last Michael Jordan team to win their 6th and final championship. And yes, the Bulls did fall short in 5 games against LeBron James and Dwayne Wade's Miami Heat. But, with Derrick Rose on the rise, you had Joakim Noah, you had a young Jimmy Butler come into the ranks. At some point, you had veteran players like Luol Deng, and Carlos Boozer in the fold, I felt the Bulls were poised to be a great team for a really long time and perhaps get lucky enough to see them return to their former glory and hoist a title like the days of Michael Jordan, Scottie Pippen. But, you know, every NBA fan knows the story that comes next. The following year, the Bulls, another great season, another 60-win season, number one in the East. D Rose gets hurt in the final minutes of game one when they were up almost 15, I believe. And for some reason, Tom Thibodeau insisted on keeping Derrick Rose in the final minute. He ended up blowing out his knee, landing awkwardly on one of his trademark layups. And unfortunately, Derrick Rose and the Chicago Bulls were really never the same after that point. Rose did come back in some capacity and still performed at a pretty high level, leading them to some playoff appearances here and there. But it was pretty obvious that he didn't have that same explosiveness and ability to attack the basket like he had in his MVP season. And the Bulls are now, unfortunately, at the bottom of the Eastern Conference. We had some interesting draft picks this past year, so hopefully, they'll be able to turn things around. But it was certainly a sad day for Bulls fans, and a sad day for Derrick Rose too, because you could tell he was such a hard worker. He had such a high motor out on the floor, and while he has had some great performances in his later days, his 50-point performance with the Timberwolves a year or so ago being the first that comes to mind, you just wonder what could have been with Derrick Rose and how much of an impact he could have made on the game of basketball, because he was truly a generational talent when you look back at some of the things he did.
Yeah, absolutely, Rob. Derrick Rose, I'm surprised we haven't talked about this more, you being a Chicago and Derrick Rose fan. Derrick Rose was and still is one of my favorite players in the NBA. He was, I want to say, maybe my third or fourth NBA jersey after Garnett, Pierce, Rondo. He might have been my first non-Celtics NBA jersey, actually. That's how much I really adored Derrick Rose and his game back in the day. And this was actually a year or two removed from his injury when I got that jersey. Sort of when he was on the up and up, kept running into other injuries. I think he had a meniscus in 2013, 2014 or so, and a plethora of other injuries that really put him on the shelf for what should have been the prime years of his career. But I think you're right in saying that those 62-20 Chicago Bulls, they really had a good shot. And you wonder, had they prevailed in those 2011 playoffs against the Heat, what kind of a matchup would they have been for the eventual champions, the Dallas Mavericks? I think they certainly would have had a shot at the very least in that series. And perhaps you're looking at a different decade, quite frankly. And one last thing I'll say on Derrick Rose is, I mentioned the Kobe, the 60 points, but on the flip side of that, Derrick Rose's injury was actually one of those quote unquote sports moments that I was able to experience watching on live TV. A lot of the time we hear about these secondhand, especially these days with social media, or whether we're just watching the highlights or reading, say, Bleacher Report the next day. But I remember seeing that live, and I didn't necessarily know, nor did anyone, the severity of the injury instantaneously. But you're right. I mean, that game was over for all intents and purposes, and it's just going to go down as one of the really sad stories in NBA history, even if Derrick Rose has sort of had a second career, more so as a shooter than the explosive athlete we saw during his MVP campaign. But yeah, Derrick Rose, ladies and gentlemen, he definitely had a shot at really lighting the NBA on fire for more than just that season.
Yeah, and as much as I loved Tom Thibodeau and the energy he brought to that team, his ability to develop those young players and just coach such a great defensive basketball team, I'm never going to forgive him for leaving D Rose in. He really quashed a great opportunity for a great player over the span of his career. So I wish Tom Thibodeau the best of luck with the Knicks. Hopefully he can turn them around, because it doesn't seem like anyone else can. But I'll always remember that decision. I'm sure Bulls fans all across Chicago will too.
Imagine the Knicks sign Derrick Rose with Tibbs at the helm right now. That would be an interesting epilogue in NBA history if that were indeed the case. But
that would be.
Moving on to number 5, my final thing that I'm grateful for, although I'm grateful for so very much more in sports, but the final item on this countdown, I'll pose it. I'll pose it as a question. What do Giannis Antetokounmpo, Maria Sharapova, Yao Ming, Usain Bolt, Serena Williams, Dirk Nowitzki, Cristiano Ronaldo, and Joel Embiid all have in common? The answer, Rob, they all come from different countries. There's nobody on that list that I named that has the same home country. And that brings me to number 5, and that is the globalization of sports. Obviously, you and I, Rob, we're fans first and foremost of some of our American sports leagues, which are quite often hailed as the pinnacle of sports, obviously, depending on what particular sport it is. You look at basketball and the NBA, the NFL obviously doesn't have too much competition unless you consider the Canadian Football League a viable threat. But then you look at other sports. You have soccer, obviously, is hailed as an international sport. The majority of the best players in the game do not play in the MLS. They play, say, in Premier League soccer or whatever the case may be. And then so many of our individual athletes, I mentioned Serena Williams in tennis, but so many of our great tennis players, such as, Roger Federer or Novak Djokovic, they are international players, and tennis isn't an American sport, really. It's something that occurs at the international stage. And, whether it is watching some of these athletes compete at the international level or seeing some of the greats that other countries have to offer making their way to the NBA, such as a Hakeem Olajuwon or a Giannis, Dirk, Joel Embiid, it's a privilege and an honor. I come at this from the perspective of basketball being, for all intents and purposes, an American sport, or at least in terms of how it's developed, what it's evolved into. But just especially under David Stern as the NBA's commissioner, and rest in peace, obviously, to Mr. Stern, the NBA just grew into a beloved international league that began to inspire young people all around this world in so very many countries. You see skills camps and academies, obviously, in many nations. And frankly, the NBA's international representation, it's extremely high, especially relative to years past. So I guess it's just one of those things. You and I were talking about before we started recording today, just about some of the athletes that have come out of our hometown or our local area. And that's so cool. But what's just as cool is seeing, say, a great Ukrainian athlete make their way to the United States and dominate in their sport. And just the globalization of many sports is something, again, I don't necessarily take for granted. And it's really been really nice to watch unfold.
Absolutely, and I couldn't agree more. And that's why my number 5 on our list is the World Cup and the Olympics, which are perhaps two of the biggest events in the sports world. When you think about it on a global scale, the world comes together in the spirit of competition, and they give us the opportunity to watch the best athletes on planet Earth. You mentioned names like Cristiano Ronaldo and Usain Bolt, Maria Sharapova, Serena Williams. You also get all-time great athletes like Michael Phelps, Lionel Messi, Rafael Nadal. The list goes on. Lindsey Vonn, and the great thing that I find about the World Cup and especially the Olympics is, the pride you have for your country and the fact that it keeps you glued to the TV for almost 3 or 4 weeks, and you're watching events like bobsled or pole vaulting that you would never watch otherwise. But just the aura of international competition and the ability to watch such great athletes go against each other on such an enormous stage is just so intriguing. And you really do get a sense of energy and pride watching American athletes, if you're an American, on that platform. The atmospheres, especially in the World Cup, I've come to know are absolutely electric. There's so much passion for a lot of these events that you don't really see in American sports, but getting to see how excited fans from around the world get at a goal in soccer, or a hurdler in a relay, is really interesting. You get a glimpse into other cultures and how they view sports and how it shapes their own lives and experiences. I'm sure they're a little weirded out when we get all up in arms about the NBA Finals or the Super Bowl. So it really broadens not only your knowledge of sports, but what you're able to see from people and their favorite teams and their favorite players. And before we sort of wrap this up, Aiden, I'd like to know what your favorite events are in some of these uh, Olympic uh, games. I would say my favorite summer event, I'd have to say track. Seeing a guy like Usain Bolt just cook everyone else out on that track and run, I think it's 100 meters in under 10 seconds, it's something no human should ever be able to do. And my favorite winter event would have to be ice hockey. The USA-Canada rivalry is one that I'll always sit down to watch. Even if there's a little bit of bad blood involved, it's really amazing to see those two countries become so impassioned and battle it out. You obviously go back to the United States and the Soviet Union in their famous 1980 game up in Lake Placid, which I'm sure isn't too far from where you hail from in Rochester, but you really get some of the most exciting and famous sports moments in world history when you look at places like the World Cup and the Olympics.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned Lake Placid. I've been to the site, the Olympic Center of the Miracle on Ice. I think I was there right around 2012, 2013, and I've really wanted to go back. But yeah, it's just one of those buildings or structures that you just feel a crazy attachment to, just based off of what's gone down within those walls and the history involved. But getting back to your question on my favorite Olympic sports, I think obviously basketball is a given. I actually love international basketball specifically. It's a little bit unique compared to the NBA, just in terms of the rhythm of the game, as well as a couple miscellaneous rule changes or adaptations. But basketball is a given. I love tennis. I've talked about tennis a little bit on this podcast, and watching it at the international stage is obviously huge as well. But just to throw in a couple of wild cards, volleyball is extremely fun to watch. I can never watch enough volleyball. This one's even more random. I actually love Olympic water polo, believe it or not. It's one of the craziest sports to me that I've never had a chance to try, but just the amount of exertion required to stay afloat and yet maintain mastery at a skilled game. It's interesting to watch, and it's just something that I tend to tune into whenever the Olympics are on. And then I don't know, I also love the track and field events. Table tennis is fun for its own reasons. You can only watch it for so long, but every time it comes on, you just have this sense of appreciation and just realizing how very transcendent they are. You will never ever approach the level of a master table tennis player. So those are just a few. It's hard for me to name a favorite outside of maybe basketball and tennis, but it has a lot to offer, winter and summer Olympics.
For sure. And I love the fact that you brought up how watching events like the Olympics or even the World Cup, uh, they allow you to see how much some of these athletes are in good shape. Like the ability, like you said, water polo to go full exertion, for however long they play, is remarkable. And you wonder how many hours in the gym they spend. We talked about LeBron James spending hours in the gym, millions on his body. But I would have to guess that his efforts, as great as they are, might be dwarfed by some of what these Olympic athletes do in terms of training year round for the events that they have to run and perform in. It's really incredible. You see not only some of the best athletes in the world, but some of the healthiest, most fit people in the world at the Olympics as well.
Yeah, Rob, there's so much at stake. It's 3 or 4 weeks. It's not an 82 game NBA season or 160 odd games in the MLB. So there's so much at stake, and I absolutely cannot wait for our 2020 Olympics, which have been rescheduled at this point for 2021.
That's right. There's absolutely no room for error when it comes down to those 3 or 4 weeks in July, August, and of course for the winter. January and February. But that's going to wrap things up for episode 15 of the WCHC Sports Podcast. Thanks to everyone for listening in. We wish you all a very happy Thanksgiving. I know things might be a little different this year with all that's going on in the world, but I hope you're still able to enjoy all the things that make Thanksgiving great to you and your family. So Aidan, happy Thanksgiving to you. I'm very thankful for having you as my co-host. I've had an awesome time doing this podcast with you over the past few months, and here's to the next 15 episodes.
Right back at you, Rob, and stay safe, everyone. Have a happy Thanksgiving, and we will catch you on the next podcast.